Does violence beget violence, or does it solve violence? If you grew up like me, spankings, beatings, or whoopings, like my family called them, were an expected event, a regularly scheduled occurrence. I wasn't bad, I just made mistakes. And it was with the nearest item my mother or grandmother found to let me have it. Combs, belts, brushes, newspaper like a dog, switches I had to pick myself. The skinny ones, they stung like hell, but the thick ones hurt too. Extension cords, ping pong paddles. Parents say it's an acceptable form of punishment, but I believe it justifies the abuse from their abuser in their own mind. Asking my abuser, the one still alive, why she beat me, she said she whooped me because she was whooped. She wasn't even looking at the act of beating me objectively. She used the, I turned out all right, or the excuse, it worked for me, and they did it out of love, as an excuse to keep the abuse in perpetuation. A bit of history. The plantation overseer, they whipped their property to put fear in the slaves they owned, so they would submit to their authority. Any different today? Terror from the slaves in the field gave way to them beating their children in the shack, or at times in the presence of the slave owner, in forced cooperation to break a child's spirit. Let that sink in for a moment. To break a child's spirit.
James, your name is Toby. I want to hear you say it. Your name is Toby. You're going to learn to say your name. Let me hear you say it. What's your name?
Kunta Kinte.
When the master gives you something, you take it. He gave you a name. It's a nice name. It's Toby. And it's going to be yours till the day you die. Now, I know you understand me, and I want to hear it. Again! I want to hear you say your name. Your name is Toby. What's your name?
Kunta.
Lord God, help that boy. They're gonna whip him dead.
What's your name? Say it. Toby. Who are you? Say your name. What's your name?
Toby.
Hi. Say it again. Say it louder so they all can hear you. What's your name?
Toby. My name is Toby.
Hi. That's a good nigger.
Many parents beat their children to keep them from acting out in front of authority figures, hoping to save their life with this tactic. But, as we've seen, this does not work. Let's go to the footage from WMAR.
One new video shows what appears to be an angry, embarrassed mother taking out some frustration on her teenage son after discovering he was one of the troublemakers in Baltimore. Take a look. Well, you can hear the woman shout, "I know that's you," before she rips off the teenager's mask. This video So you can imagine he's getting a lot of attention online. Baltimore's police commission even took notice.
And if you saw on one scene, you had one mother who grabbed their child who had a hood on his head, and she started smacking him on the head because she was so embarrassed. I wish I had more parents that took charge of the kids out there tonight.
All of this, of course, came just hours after the funeral of Freddie Gray, who died of severe spinal cord injury while in police custody. His family, Gray's family, denounced the violence, saying, "I want you all to get justice for my son." I'm reading the quote here, but I don't do it like this here. I don't think that's for Freddie. I think the violence, she says, is wrong. That was his twin sister, Frederica.
How many of us praised that woman? Clapped for that woman? How many of us sneered at that woman? How many judged that woman's conduct as absolutely reprehensible? Y'all remember this guy? Let's go to the footage from WDSU.
It was love, and I wanted to really show that he's not a gang member. You know, we don't come from this.
Tonight, the uncle of a slain teenager defends what he calls an act of love. The Terrytown teen made internet headlines after he was seen being disciplined by his uncle for claiming to be a gangster just last week. The young man was shot to death outside of his home. WDSU reporter Sydney Chewin spoke to the teen's family. Sydney?
Scott, 16-year-old Michael Taylor's family says he was not in a gang, but they acknowledge that he glorified that lifestyle, which may have led to his murder.
This my nephew right here. He ain't no gang member. We don't come from that. You tell him.
It's been nearly a year since this video went viral. But that was never Lemoyne Ward's intention. He says he simply wanted to set the record straight after he caught his nephew boasting about being in a gang on Facebook. But Ward never imagined his nephew, 16-year-old Michael Taylor, would be gunned down multiple times near his Terrytown apartment complex last week.
I was led by right spirit when I did it, but now the enemy is twisting it in my head like I did something wrong, like maybe I draw some extra attention to him to make him feel like he needs to prove to these people that he's not soft.
After the video surfaced, Taylor was picked on and ridiculed at school. His mother, Kimberly Ward, describes him as a good kid, but one who may have desperately been trying to fit in. Ward says it was tough love to try to save his nephew from the streets.
Do you regret posting that video to Facebook?
Not at all. Not at all. I regret maybe not being a part of his life a little bit more after the video.
Taylor's family says he understood why his uncle disciplined him, but they believe he was already a victim of a culture that glorifies gang life and violence. Taylor's family has this advice for parents. They say to check your children's Facebook pages and be active in their lives. And most of all, they say, don't be a friend, but be a parent.
See how that didn't work out like he had hoped? See how embedded corporal punishment is in the fabric of the African American identity that he actually thought he was acting from love? So initially, beating our children began as a measure to prevent violence. But over the generation, it has just become so deeply ingrained in the black culture, especially when God's translation for rod means switch. This is a falsehood, people. Biblical literasts have misappropriated this facet of biblical understanding regarding discipline. If thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me in Psalm 23, how can it be used to whip me? The rod is used to guide. But since we aren't literal sheep herders, we don't really have a rod anymore. We use our words to translate understanding. Through language, one acquires education. That's why it was stated in the previous video. As soon as we were free, we built schools. Discipline in its purest form means disciple or student. I've seen many schools replacing detention with meditation with miraculous results. But how many of us have been subject to these phrases? This will hurt me more than it'll hurt you. I brought you into this world, I can take you out. Like they're property or something. Like fulfilling the obligations their parents laid out is the right way. But is it? The approach to treating our children like livestock, this slave mentality that has been indoctrinated into us all those 400 years, does not honor the true divinity that each soul is. And acquiring guidance for mental health, that's shunned by most because of the perceived shame associated with it, which keeps many locked up in this mentality. Oh, and lack of concentration that Big Pharma calls ADD just to push pills when it's really PTSD. Aside from those reasons, here are just a few more on why we spank our children. How can we recognize that beatings are not the best way to address behavior in children? How do we recognize that shame and guilt manipulate us into a shell of who we truly are? How do we get from under the burden of this denial? Well, to help, let's look at how this mindset affects us. We equate pain with protection and love. You see it in cliches like love hurts. You see it in those suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. You see it in the fights in reality television. Because of the fear and the criticism that our children have to bear, and the shame of their dignity being stripped from them at the hands of whatever our abuser chooses to use at the moment, whatever they can find, our kids are more likely to drop out of school, more likely to live in poverty, more likely to commit violent crimes, more likely to become part of the HIV statistic, more likely to show aggression. But children should actually have a safe space to express themselves, especially anger. Be angry but sin not. List goes on. And so will I. Because this needs to be driven into the soul of our community. The physical punishment of our children is linked to all types of delinquencies. And what happens to the child of the mother whose boyfriend had his whooping way with the baby? But furthermore, antisocial behavior, it decreases the parent-child relationship. Children's mental health suffers. They have excessive feelings of sadness, difficulties in sleeping, suicide, anxiety, distant relationships. It creates confusion with our children's capacity to understand socially acceptable behavior. And consider, when the child is not in school, he or she can't put his hands on anyone like their parents do them. So what devices are they left up to? After I received my healing, and yes, I have been healed, I'm just passionate about this change. Part of my completion process was talking to my abuser. I asked her, you know I was just as dumb after the whooping as before it, right? We cannot go on beating our children when this type of behavior is not acceptable. We all know that the people who reproduce this type of behavior, they lose their autonomy and their freedom. Ask any inmate. So our children grow up into these adults. They've been subject to this type of physical punishment, and they're more likely to abuse their child or their spouse or manifest criminal behavior themselves. It should be no surprise, and I believe that it's no coincidence that those locked up in the prison industrial complex, they have locked up emotions on the inside of them because they weren't able to express themselves as children. And the physical abuse that they have suffered, they've not been able to address. Just a vicious cycle of resentment, shame, and guilt, within and also by a judge of law. I have compassion though, because my parents, just like your parents, were doing the best they knew how at the time. But we cannot bring our past in the future. The law of reciprocity tells us that we reap what we sow. If our mind is locked up, so shall our bodies be. If our minds are diseased, so shall our bodies be. As above, so below. As within, so without. Ancient teachings tells us that we've been given all power in heaven and on earth. So this devastating cycle continues, is perpetuated, and it continues because the general consensus says that mental health professionals are for the weak-willed or for the weak-minded. But nothing could be further from the truth. Ask any entrepreneur, success is learned. Beatings and whoopings are the real reflection of weakness. think about it. You don't know what to say, so you get frustrated with your own ignorance. Then you take that anger out on your children. We forget, in 1984, Marvin Gaye's father, a minister, fatally shot his son after a lifetime of abuse. So I ask you again, does violence beget violence, or does it rectify violence? And I'm asking you to think for yourself, instead of thinking from the conditioned mind you may have inherited. The reason I'm here before you is to empower you, to know that you can grow into the healed, whole self that you are. So here is a list of 17 formative ways to discipline children. I actually had to learn some of these techniques myself, being a Sunday school teacher and all. So please take a screenshot of this information. You'll see it at the end of the video. And share it. And share it on your other page. And then blog about it. Because we're all a part of the same future. Let's make it happy and healthy and bright for everyone. Peace and love.
Everybody's searching for a hero. People need someone to look up.